So we are live. Uh, so thank you for much for thank Dr. Smith for accepting my invitation for believing in this project. Um, First, for the ones who are here, today we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Smith about many interesting topics and important topics for our area. And first of all, I want to talk a little bit about this project that it's called Language Learning Lives. It's a series of live interviews with researchers of foreign language learning and teaching, specialists who are somehow concerned with the development of teachers and learners' lives. So the first participant is Dr. Richard Smith. Actually, his name was the first one that came to my mind because of his work with teaching in difficult circumstances. So I think we'll have a nice talk now, and I will introduce you. Uh, so Dr. Richard Smith is an applied linguist and language teacher educator who works in a range of language learning and teaching issues, especially in relation to the worldwide learning and teaching of English for speakers of other languages. He's a reader and associate professor at the University of Warwick and founder of the Warwick ELT Archive and the ILA Research Network on History of Language Learning and Teaching. His publications include several chapters and articles on teacher learning autonomy, pedagogy of autonomy as appropriate methodology, and the relationship of teacher research and teacher autonomy. So, welcome, Dr. Richard Smith. How are you, and how are things in your city?
Well, Ronaldo, thanks very much for inviting me. And I'm okay. I'm fine. I'm at home with my family, my wife, my two boys. We're um, we're at home all the time, going out for a walk every day, which I'm really grateful or glad that we can do.
Yeah,
Still, I know some countries people can't do that. Um, and I think anyway, it'd be very hard to not have any exercise. But we at least have a walk. We have enough food. Again, I'm grateful for
yeah,
that. Although a lot of the time is spent trying to work out where to get food. I guess the same for a lot of people.
yeah. It's been very
Since
difficult for some
yeah,
people.
yeah. So Ronaldo, where are you? We don't know each other, so tell me,
Yeah.
where are you and
So I'm in
how?
Sydney, Australia now.
Yeah.
It's I'm here as a visiting fellow at Macquarie University, but actually I haven't been there yet because of this. We are on lockdown since the day because when I arrived here, the instruction was to be at home for 14 days to see if we some any symptoms will appear would appear. Um, and then after this period, we went on lockdown, and so we still are on lockdown. So now we can go for a walk, we can go to the supermarket, but the situation is still very critical here.
Yeah, yeah. Same. We closed university 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
Uh, some, obviously interaction with students, trying to keep in touch with students. Some planning of, what to do about exams, especially. But there's a understanding that basically there won't be any teaching until, well, October, the beginning of the year, beginning of the next academic year.
yeah,
Any
it's
face-to-face teaching, really. Yeah.
yeah. I think
So there we are. So
we won't be the same after this
yeah,
crisis. So let's see what
who knows?
happens.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought when you contacted me, I was really thankful to you. I thought it's great that you're doing something proactive, and it's just always nice to talk to people these days, isn't it? Anyway, so I was grateful for your invitation. I don't know if it's going to be um, interesting, useful for people. Let's hope it will be.
I'm sure it will be, and I'm very honored for, I mean, because you accepted, and because we're starting this together.
Yeah,
So I will start by this conversation by asking you about your experience in Japan. So, can you please tell us a little bit about your teaching experience there and how you got interested in autonomous learning?
yeah, sure. Well, I've been in the UK, but as a teacher educator at Warwick University for the last 20 years. But I did spend quite a long time in Japan previously, 13 years in total.
Hmm.
First of all in high schools, and then later, a little bit later, in universities for about I suppose 10 years in total.
Hmm.
And I would say that going, you asked me, we're mainly going to be talking about learner autonomy, I guess, and autonomy and teacher autonomy. So you asked me, when did I first get interested in autonomy? Well, actually, I think looking back, I wasn't calling it autonomy, but I was quite interested in books like even when I was at school. I remember a teacher introducing us to a book called Deschooling Society
Hmm.
by Ivan Illich, and I suppose I was a bit of a quiet rebel at school. I didn't really like the way things were done at school, and
I feel
that
you.
appealed to me. And also, I'd heard about things like Summerhill by A.S. Neil. So this kind of thing appealed to me, and as I said, was a quiet rebel. So I sort of went my own way in some ways in studying things that I wanted to study, and sort of dropping subjects I didn't want to study at school. But I suppose when I became an English teacher later on, after graduating from university, we were inducted into a communicative approach, communicative language
Hmm.
teaching, which in its own way was very exciting, to experience and to learn to teach in a new way, really, from what I had experienced myself in school and at university. Lots of power, lots of interaction, this kind of thing. So I guess when I went to Japan straight after university, I didn't have, anyway, autonomy wasn't in my mind as a word, but those things I'd read were connected later on for me, with autonomy. But I was more excited with the methods, new community language teaching methodology, and trying to introduce that into a Japanese secondary school.
Hmm.
Um, Successfully in some ways, but never completely appropriately. And I suppose after a few years in Japan, and after doing an MA in the UK, sort of starting to think of things a bit more broadly, not just in terms of particular methods. Um, I also got work at a university where I was less constrained, really. I had more freedom myself to experiment, and I was already starting to think that actually some aspects of communicative approach are not really suitable, especially the way of the kind of presentation, practice, production sort of PPP kind of thing.
Hmm.
I was getting much into more project based learning. I don't know what I was calling it at that time. I suppose task based, project based, and more realizing that these students at this university I was at could actually get on with things without me planning everything. They
Hmm.
were planning more and more, and I I think there was a particular class where it was called a listening class. I was told I had to teach them listening skills in English, and I'd already become very frustrated with sort of how to teach listening. It always seemed to be um, switching on, giving some
Yeah.
pre tasks, switching on the tape recorder. Everybody sort of me just listening there, standing there with the tape recorder, as it was in those days. And this was like mid 90s, mid 1990s, uh, and then sort of testing their comprehension, and then listening again for it's sort of more like testing than teaching. It seemed to me.
Very
Um,
repetitive, right?
yeah. So I just sort of decided one day I'd ask them what they like to listen to outside class. It was connected also with my own language learning, my own learning of Japanese. I'd been writing materials for for teaching Japanese, and um, we tried to. There was more and more talk in the air about learner training and things like this. So we tried to bring in some learner training tips or advice into the materials. the textbook. But then we came confronted. So we heard from students that actually they were finding it difficult to get through our materials. They were self-study materials,
Hmm.
but it made us more aware of me and my co-author Trevor Hughes Parry more aware of what students actually go through when they're learning a language. That it's not so easy just to tell them, give them tips, and
Yeah,
expect that they can follow your instructions.
yeah. They
And
need
we were
more,
also,
right?
yeah.
And they find
So
their
we
own way.
scaffold this sort of dialogue maybe. So
Mm.
we were in Japan learning Japanese in the environment as well. And we decided to have a presentation actually about how people in the environment were trying to learn Japanese. And we were amazed by all the tips and all the ideas, the strategies that maybe non-Japanese in Japan were using to in their own language learning. And I thought I'd bring some of that into my teaching, I think. And I was again, I asked the students, so what do you like to listen to outside class? What would you like to be doing for listening? And they had a great variety of answers. Uh, they all had different goals for their own language learning. And I remember that just the first step into, I suppose, what I'd call an autonomy-oriented pedagogy now, although even at that time I wasn't thinking of it in those terms. I was thinking of it as a kind of extension of project-based learning
Hmm.
to have them in groups listening to different materials which they would bring in themselves and play on tape recorders, or they would be in different rooms. And that was my first sort of step into really following and negotiating with students what to do in the class. After several kind of failed attempts to learn a kind of strategy tips sort of oriented kind of teaching, which always seemed to me a bit more top down. So I guess
Yeah,
that was my first steps into it.
yeah. So
Yeah.
you told now that at that time you didn't call it autonomy, but now let's talk about this concept. Researching more about you, I found a presentation of yours that you define autonomy as a slippery concept. So can you tell us why you use that metaphor?
Actually, I don't remember saying that, but it's I'm sure you're right. Well, I suppose yeah. I'm thinking now, sort of historically, back
Hmm.
in those days. We started a group, a teacher development group, with coming out of those reflections on our own learning of Japanese initially, but also starting to think how we incorporating our reflection on our own learning of Japanese mainly at that point
Hmm.
uh, into our pedagogy, our teaching, and that's when I think I became more and more conscious of autonomy and the work of Henri Olek, for example, which I'd come across in my MA a bit earlier, but I was starting to relate things much more to Olek, and then more and more people were conceiving of what they were doing in terms of autonomy, but people coming from many different
Areas.
directions.
Hmm. Yeah.
There was a conference in Hong Kong which brought things together. I think it was 1995, and a lot of people from classroom-based pedagogies like Lenny Dam, David Little was there, Philip Riley, who's much more focusing, like Oleg, on self-access centres, and Hong Kong was a big centre for self-access centres.
Hmm.
That time, which was never my concern. My interest was in classrooms and what students did outside the classrooms. Well, so I think more and more people were conceiving of what they were doing in terms of the concept of learner autonomy, and of course, Philip Benson wrote a book. David Little wrote books about that concept,
Hmm.
and well, that was good. I mean, autonomy as a goal, a unifying concept, which different people could come together and share their experiences, but also their thoughts about what autonomy meant. It was an exciting time. On the other hand, I started to feel at one point, I can't remember when, I think it was the 1990s, especially when, or maybe even the early 2000s,
Hmm.
when I'd come back to the UK and I was supervising students who were coming to me and saying, here's this new buzzword, autonomy. I want to write dissertations about it. I was starting to feel it was becoming a kind of academic concept without that connection with practice that I'd
Hmm.
experienced myself. And so the discussions about what does autonomy mean, of course, are important because different people are using the concept actually meaning quite different things.
Hmm.
Some people may be meaning a situation of learning on your own, which it never was for me. Others are thinking of it as a behavior, autonomous learning. Others thinking of it as a capacity. That ambiguity was there from the very beginning. Oleg was using the learner autonomy to mean a capacity to take control of your learning, whereas Leslie Dickinson was using it at the same time as the actual situation or sort of behavior of self-directed learning, which is what we might call. I mean, I prefer to call the behavior, the actual
Hmm.
actions as self-directed learning,
Yeah.
and the readiness or the capacity or the ability as autonomy, because this is how Oleg was using it. But of course, that is not how people outside our discourse community use the word autonomy. They tend to think of it as a kind of freedom from constraints, and not so much this capacity, this readiness, which is something, as Oleg realized, he wanted adults to come and learn, encourage adults to come back to the university and learn languages
Hmm.
and learn with all the resources they were providing, but realized that actually they needed some guidance in how to go about it, which they hadn't received from their own education. And that their focus there at Crapel in France became how to support adults in making use of the resources, and that's when they conceived of learner autonomy as that capacity that they needed to develop. So always it's had these different meanings,
Hmm.
and that's well. I remember, if you don't mind me just talking, I'm talking a bit more. I remember a conference and in Nottingham. I think it was the 2000 around
I found a
2005 or
PPT.
so.
I can send you the link later.
Okay, fine. It may have been that conference though. I don't know. That Zoltan Dernier was there, and of course he's a very rigorous
Hmm.
I suppose, researcher in the field, and just it was not coming from the field of autonomy. He was invited to because he's at Nottingham to say something about autonomy. He said I think it's not a very well defined concept in
Yeah.
terms of from his point, which I guess is true. But we always do need to have it. We do need to provide our definitions. I think we need to try to define what we mean personally. Um, but I don't think we should waste a lot of time
Hmm.
worrying about that. We have our view, and to me, it's a question of importance of relating it to practical interventions, and it's quite a useful concept in that area.
So when you mean slippery, uh, maybe
Yeah,
you could be uh, mentioning the dangers of not being aware of the concepts that I mean, the concepts of autonomy that you're working with.
I
Is
think
that it?
it's right, and I think yeah, and it's also, I guess, when we talk about autonomy together with others, that we just try to make clear what we mean by it, because otherwise we can think we're talking about the same thing
Yeah.
when actually we're talking about different things. Maybe.
Yeah. And the more we
How do
talk,
you
the
feel about
more
that?
we elaborate. Um so
Yeah. How do you feel about that, Ronaldo? Do you find that is a problem?
I don't think it's a problem, but I think it's very difficult to define such a concept because it's very
Yeah.
abstract, and when it's related, self-related, it becomes even more difficult. So I share your thoughts about that.
But it's an exciting concept to
Yes,
work with.
yes,
So
yes.
I think we don't. I said at that conference, I kind of agree with Zoltan Deni from that perspective. If you're going to research autonomy, it's important. It's a bit slippery as compared with something like self-regulation, or something which has a clear kind of
Yeah,
definition. But if you're a practitioner, if you're thinking of work with students, it's a really useful idea to have in your mind. And I think of it in quite simple terms, perhaps as the students' own capacity to control their learning. And I'm satisfied personally with that kind of
yeah, yeah.
definition.
For me, I mean, I'm interested in out of school learning. So I want to understand what happens outside the classroom. So we can bring it to inside the classroom, and
Yeah.
so both can uh, have a connection. Because sometimes
Yeah.
you learn something
Yeah.
at school. I mean, students learn something that are completely out of their uh, reality. So in this way, autonomy
Yeah. And
is not achieved or doesn't exist.
that's exactly my perspective, I think, because I saw the way these students who are often characterized as Japanese students as passive or as sort of in a kind of Orientalist way,
Mm-hmm.
actually, as not active, and I began to see that very much as a function of or caused by the educational arrangements because they were,
Yeah.
as I started to talk to them, or actually, what I did was I asked them to write little things to me about what they were doing because they wouldn't be so willing to speak out in class. And I was hearing all the things they were actually doing, these students, to learn English because it was very important for them and things that I would never have imagined. And that's why I think I started to want to bring that more into what was going on in the classroom
Mm-hmm.
and to trust the students more and recognize their existing capacities
Yeah.
for learning, control of their learning, and that contradicts for me a different approach, which is to assume that they don't know
Mm-hmm.
and to start to teach them in a top-down way what they should be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with you. I think we share the same beliefs
Yeah,
about it. Uh,
yeah.
one concept that I think it's also very interesting is your concept of teacher learner autonomy. So, could you talk more about this concept that you developed, this notion that you developed and have been writing a lot about, and how it is important to language learning and teaching, especially in times like ours?
Hmm. Well, um, I'm not sure about I'm not sure about the relevance to times like ours. It's only since you contacted me, which was like what a week ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've all been just trying to cope with things in our own lives. And it was only then that I started to think, well, maybe some of the work I've done could be of relevance, particularly to
Yes.
times like ours. I haven't really had the time to think about it. I'm very happy to explore that with you
Mm-hmm.
today. But um, so let's just to make clear, this is not my goal here at all to say I know how we should be coping
No,
with
no,
these
no.
terrible times. But yeah, thinking back, I think it's the notion of teacher learner, teacher hyphen learner autonomy. I think I better start by defining what I mean by that. Um, it's uh, it's just viewing really teachers as learners, just as we think of we have students, we have learners.
Mm-hmm.
We talk a lot about learner autonomy. It's just putting the mirror, I think, in front of ourselves and realizing that we are also learners. That was quite clear to me at that time in Japan because it was very important professionally, I suppose and for my general life that I tried to learn Japanese, and that was what I was reflecting on most at the beginning. And I think that's what I started writing about. So the stimulus for it was that there was again a conference, a kind of academic thing that people were starting to talk about teacher autonomy in the same breath as learner autonomy around 1999 2000, and I found that a bit annoying that people were not really defining. Goes back to our conversation earlier.
Mm-hmm.
People were not really defining what they meant by teacher autonomy, and just assuming that the two things were the same thing. I couldn't see that myself. You know, teacher autonomy. I thought of as a kind of freedom from constraints of teachers, whereas learner autonomy, as we were conceptualizing it within the field, was not that. It was more the capacity of learners to learn, take control of their learning.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought, well, surely one aspect of teacher autonomy, at least, because there was a conference set up. It was called Teacher Autonomy, Learner Autonomy in Nottingham, and I thought I would join that. So I reflected on myself as a language learner, as a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and thought that well, I'm conscious of having autonomy sometimes and sometimes not not having autonomy, not having that ability to take control, that makes me a little bit humble because actually we're expecting something of learners that we don't always have ourselves. Um, and that was one reflection that we can bring in, I think, to our teaching, that ourselves as language learners.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I think that's something that so-called non-native speaker teachers have often as an advantage over native speaker teachers, that they've gone through the same process as their learners, and we can use you can use that as your as an experience to draw on. Um, but So I wrote this article. I think it was called "Starting with Ourselves." Teacher learner autonomy, something like that. So it was basically writing about my and others' experience of language learning and how teachers themselves are always learners of a language, whether it's the language they are teaching or a language of the students and the society that they're living in. But I became aware actually at that time that, yeah, it's also relevant for one's learning of teaching and not just of language as a teacher, because I was reflecting that I was learning so much about how to teach through this kind of practice of what I call now a pedagogy for autonomy with my students that I talked about earlier in the university. As
Mm-hmm.
the more I negotiated with, the more I understood about them. I understood about how to teach in a new way, and it was something that I was learning for myself, not through some method that was given to me. I wasn't really putting into practice things that I'd read elsewhere. It was more working with the students and what they were bringing to the classroom, and I was very satisfied with that experimentation and with that feeling of working with students and not trying to impose a methodology onto them, because that was very much in my mind in those days. How can we teach appropriately in a particular context
Mm-hmm.
and not be imposing Western methods, maybe? And that may relate later to when we talk about how to teach in difficult circumstances. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's essential, that we're working with the context, working with what students themselves are bringing to it. So through the practice of reflecting a lot on what I was doing at that time out of necessity, because it was a new way, a new experience for me, and quite a confusing situation. I don't know if you've experienced this yourself, but when you start to work more with what students are bringing, you're improvising much more.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily rely on methods. You've got to be thinking in new ways. So I thought that was developing my autonomy as a teacher, or at least it was engaging my autonomy as a teacher. Can I just say one more thing? That when I moved back to the UK,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that was a kind of active research. It was that I was doing. It was a kind of practitioner research. When I came to the UK, I was basically teaching students from many different countries,
Mm-hmm.
often from East Asia. Still, we have students from China. Um, rather than they're doing their MAs in TESOL, masters in TESOL. So rather than telling them how to teach, it's very important, I think, that I be developing their capacity to learn to teach
Mm-hmm.
in their own context. Well, I've theorized that more and more, but it was more like a practical thing and a value that I had, that I wouldn't be imposing. I would be working with their knowledge, their theories, existing theories, and trying to develop those theories. So it was a kind of pedagogy of autonomy. But the tool that I used was to get them doing small action research projects, because I found I action research had benefited me, practitioner research, developing their um, getting them to teach and then to reflect on it and to learn how to teach a bit differently and then try it out again and to get data really about the improvement. So that we could call that action research. Students themselves and their assignment was to write about that process. And some students themselves, without me ever mentioning autonomy to them, said they felt that they were developing their autonomy as teachers. And I think out of that, I realized especially that actually that's a goal that is very valuable goal for teacher educators, to engage student teachers autonomy and try to develop that ability to learn for themselves, take control of their learning, because we're only with them for a short time.
Yeah. And actually,
Give them the tool.
sorry, you can continue.
No, yeah, I finished.
I was just
Go
thinking
on,
here
Louis.
that this teacher learner autonomy is, I think it's pretty much connected to the freedom also that the teacher has in his or her
Yeah.
environment, so he or she can choose. And because I believe that if you are in a very controlled uh, educational environment, that you cannot choose what to teach or not, it becomes more difficult to be autonomous.
Mm.
And also, I think this notion is very important now because teachers now in this situation, I know lots of them, and who have to totally reorganize the way they teach. And so in this way they have to learn because
Yeah.
they are used to teaching in a certain way, they were educated to teach in a certain way, and now the reality
Mm.
is different. So this so I believe this notion is super important in times like ours, as I said.
Well, as I say, I hadn't thought of it like that, but I'm happy to hear that is of interest and use to you, out to us, in thinking about it. Um, and let me think about that a bit more. That I quite agree that from one definition of autonomy, uh, freedom from constraint,
Yeah.
that yeah, I know that many teachers are very constrained in what they're allowed to do. And that, of course, limits one's ability to experiment in the way that I was talking about, the ability to negotiate with students, for example. Nevertheless, I think that I respect and admire very much the work of somebody called Flavia Vieira, who is a teacher educator in Portugal. And she has worked with teachers a lot, secondary school teachers, as I have more recently with teachers in Nepal, for example,
Hmm.
or India and Latin America. And generally, yes, teachers are constrained by a syllabus, by curriculum, by maybe by textbook, by exams, especially the felt need to prepare students for exams much more. And we are also in universities, actually, in the UK, constrained by so many of these things. Flavia has when in working with teachers, again, often doing action research projects, exploring the constraints as a way, and addressing constraints is something you can do with action research. It's a way of seeing more clearly, I think, where the constraints are and where they're not. And she has this great phrase, spaces of freedom.
Hmm.
And I think Terry Lamb also talks about spaces of maneuver because his experience was also with secondary school mainly. So there are always spaces of freedom within which a teacher can innovate. It doesn't mean complete negotiation of everything at all, but there are, even within very constrained syllabus, our perceptions
Yeah.
are not always the reality. And through reflection and research in collaboration with others, that's something we haven't mentioned, but a great misconception about autonomy is that it means isolation. Of course, it doesn't. It means working with others as well as being independent, but developing autonomy through that interaction maybe as well with other people. But we can think of it in that way.
Yeah.
I agree with you that we are constrained. In fact, these days, maybe we are less constrained than we
Hmm.
have been. This is an interesting thing to reflect on.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we are far from others, and that ability to negotiate is being decreased.
Yes.
But do we have more? Do we maybe have more freedom now as teachers? I don't know. Everything seems to be up in the
So as
air.
the students, I believe, I don't
Oh
know.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So let's move on here. Uh, so there is an article, a very inspiring article called Pedagogy of Autonomy for Difficult Circumstances, From Practice to Principles. So in this article, Kucha Kucha, is that the correct pronunciation?
yeah,
And
yeah.
you
It's
analyze his experience of teaching a very large class of more than 200 teenage learners in an under-resourced secondary school setting in Cameroon. A wonderful article, by the way. You also mentioned the distinction between pedagogy of autonomy and pedagogy for autonomy. So, could you develop more this idea with us and highlighting why and how pedagogy of autonomy can be beneficial to teaching in difficult circumstances?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for your comments about the article, which I'm most proud of. It's one of the articles I'm most proud of. Very much Harry's. I call him Harry Kucha Kucha. He was a student of mine. He did a PhD with me as well, and he's gone on to even greater things. He's now the president of IATEFL. So many people know him as Harry Kucha. But he was a student. He was a teacher and a ministry inspector after that in Cameroon. And yeah, um, I wonder if we could share the link maybe later, because I mean it'd be nice if people. I
Yeah,
think
I'll
it's
share
a
the
nice
link
article.
here on the
Yeah.
comments.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Because it's basically Harry was in my class, and I was talking about teaching about autonomy, learner autonomy, and I think it was some Lenny Dam's practice in Denmark or something, and he just said, "Wow, I was doing something like that in Africa, in his teaching in Africa, getting the students in groups, negotiating with the students what they should be doing." He said he'd never thought of it in terms of autonomy. This is where I think we don't need to be obsessed with the theoretical, academic discussions of what is autonomy. But it seemed very similar. And I do think that teachers in many contexts actually are doing things which are like a kind of pedagogy of autonomy, without calling it autonomy. So we start the whole article just by telling his story, which he told to me, of how, yeah, he was in this very difficult situation of loads of students in the class, very hot. And one day, out of frustration, partly, he asked the students, well, what do you think we should do? And they were saying, let's go outside under the shade of the trees in groups. And they basically agreed to do this, although he was very reluctant. He just didn't think they would behave themselves. And it didn't work. It was chaotic. And this is my experience as well when I started it myself. So he said, we've got to go back. We can't do this. They came back. The students basically pleaded with them and said they would take more responsibility and they would have rules, etc. So they tried it again, and through trial and error, something emerged, which was a kind of group work situation under different trees, where the students bringing in different resources themselves, and we tell the story and then theorize it from an autonomy perspective, because it does seem like the kind of thing I was doing, or the kind of thing Lenny Dan might have been doing in classrooms in different contexts. And saying, well, it wasn't a pedagogy for autonomy, which is actually Flavio Vieira's phrase, pedagogia para autonomia, because the goal wasn't a explicit goal or conscious goal in the teacher's head of developing autonomy, but you could say that it was engaging with the students' autonomy, their pre-existing autonomy, their desire, and to some extent the capacity they had, to some extent, although not a very developed extent, to take control of their learning. So I think engaging with students' autonomy for me has also always been the priority. To think that students trust students to have that in themselves, although it may have been buried and pushed down by education, paradoxically, by a kind of learned helplessness. And we may come to think about that a bit later. That schooling can produce in people, just as it can produce a feeling of learned helplessness in ourselves as teachers when we feel very constrained. Just to go back to what we were talking about earlier, how motivated, how capable do we feel as teachers to cope with this current new situation? It is terribly confusing and stressful, particularly partly because of the environment that we are in at home. But also with this, have we developed this capacity? Have our teacher educators, or have we during our careers up to now, developed this capacity to learn for ourselves? It's essential that we have it. We realize now. Can I just say one thing as well? That
Yeah,
I
of
was
course.
thinking again about this article. I just read it earlier, and I refer to somebody called Michael West, who wrote a book in 1960, which was called Teaching English in Difficult Circumstances.
Hmm.
And it struck me, he was one of the few people, since the 60s right up until I think we kind of tried to revive interest in teaching in difficult circumstances over the last 10 years or so. And Harry is now one of the leaders in this movement to think about that teaching that goes on in so many contexts in the world, which are not privileged
Hmm.
contexts with lots of technology, have large classes, etc. But Michael West was a teacher educator in what is now Bangladesh, and he said how important it is in large classes, that especially in large classes, that we train, or I think he said train students how to learn, because large classes, but also the dropout that goes on, used to go on more maybe, that students you never know when they're going to leave school,
Hmm.
age 13 or 12, whatever, to go and work. If you can if you can teach them how to learn, that's the most essential thing. So how much have we learned how to learn ourselves as teachers? How much have we helped our students to learn? It becomes really obvious now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because we depend so much on what our students can do for themselves, because we can't do it for them.
Yeah.
We're all very busy trying to devise systems. I find too much trying to devise top-down systems which reproduce what has been going on in school or university. I just asked my son, I tell him I'm doing this interview, and he's trying to cope with the homework he's been given. He said, what should I be saying? He said, um, we should be left alone more. He didn't mean he didn't mean isolated. I think he
Uh-huh.
just meant we could learn more ourselves. He said that. I didn't
Yes.
tell him I was going to autonomy. He feels it's too much of an imposition
Yeah.
of things at the moment, and um, this probably is a general feeling.
Yeah. And I also
We can
feel
go. We can do.
I also feel that it would be a very good time for students to experiment more and to see how they
Yeah,
learn
yeah,
better. And schools
yeah,
are not doing that. I know about Brazil because in Brazil, the situation is that schools are just sending homework, and uh, teaching online classes as if they were teaching face-to-face classes. So, uh,
yeah,
so as I think your talk here is very important because we have our classes are very large in Brazil, and for teaching for learning for teaching and learning a foreign language it's very difficult. And
mm,
so your speech of teaching learners how to learn, I think it gives the teacher a little bit of relief that uh, I mean he or she won't be able to uh, make students learn. So uh, that would be a good path to go through.
yeah. That's exactly what Michael West was implying. That because because the class is so big, that we need to rely on the students'
Hmm.
ability to make sense of it all. And I think Zakia Sawa, who's another person I've interviewed, she is a teacher educator in Pakistan, again with teacher as well in large classes, and her project based approach is very much in that area as well. That a teacher needs to do things like that to cope with that kind of situation. It's not something we can do now though,
Hmm.
because we're not in classes.
Yeah.
I was in contact with some teachers in Nepal. They don't have access to technologies which are going to enable them to do everything that teachers in the US or UK are being encouraged to do, which is immediately try to reach the students in the same kind of way, which is kind of, well, it's what we're being encouraged to do.
Hmm.
If we could leave students a freedom to find their own paths, they may find paths, they may not. It all depends on what has gone before. This is what's problematic.
Yeah.
It's easy to say this, but if we had trained students more to learn in their own, follow their own pathways, to become more autonomous,
Hmm.
then we could focus more on the students to
Yeah,
do that. And maybe we can more than we know, actually.
yeah,
Maybe it is a time, I'm sure it is a time when people, many people will, you know, not just students, but people at home will discover they'll learn new
yeah.
things we'd never thought we'd learn.
And it has to do a lot with the cultures of learning because uh,
Mm.
I heard many colleagues in Brazil complaining that now that they are in this situation, the parents are complaining that's because the teachers are not teaching. Uh, so, what it means to be a teacher uh,
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah,
people's
mm,
minds also collaborates to this situation also.
yeah. That's right. So sort of interesting, whole interesting dynamics are going on, aren't they, with the kind of re-involvement of parents
Yes.
in the teaching, which may have been, you know, responsibility given over to the school
Hmm.
completely.
Yeah.
You know, that the parents have felt they don't need to be engaged in their children's learning once they go to school. It's not really their job. It's a teacher's job, but that's being reassessed
Yes.
completely. And as you say, yeah, that view that what teaching is, it just can't be reproduced very effectively anyway, through technology, if the technology is available. But in many, I mean, in the majority of schools around the world, that technology is not going to be available anyway.
Yes.
It's another case where what we are all talking about in the UK or in the USA, possibly Australia, where technology is perhaps where you can assume that maybe almost all people that maybe have internet, they may not though have a computer.
Hmm.
You know, it, it brings out those differences between the rich and the poor, doesn't it? Between those who have and those who don't have.
Yeah.
You can't assume things. We assume much too much, I think, in at the moment in our discourse about what's going on, that our students have what we think they should have.
Yeah. It's kind
You
of
know,
cruel.
they, well, we need to find out more. We need to find out about our students in the first place. I think,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
is their situation,
As I said
develop
before, I
rapport.
think we won't be the same after this crisis. So I think uh, it will, our theories and our practices as teachers and researchers will be totally affected. That's what I feel about
Hmm.
what we're having now. So everybody's engaged here. There are some people watching and they are posting comments, and later you
Ah,
can read them. Uh,
I, yeah, I can. Yeah.
Lots of them saying thank you for this insightful and fruitful video. And now I think we can conclude. And before we conclude, I want to hear uh, your thoughts on how a pedagogy of autonomy can be a rescue strategy for teacher educators, for teachers, and for learners.
Okay, Ronaldo. Let me make very clear that everything I've ever written about autonomy has always come out of practice.
Hmm.
It's always been a reflection on practice. I've never wanted to make any theory for the sake of theory.
Hmm.
But these things like teacher autonomy or pedagogy of autonomy, that's not my practice. That was out of Harry's practice. The idea of engaging with students or believing that students have a capacity, even if not a very developed capacity, to plan things for themselves, to set goals, etc., to decide on what and how they learn. That's the starting point. That we engage with what students are saying in this context about how they like to learn,
Hmm.
about what they are willing to learn, what they want to do, etc. That's a starting point for that idea of a pedagogy of autonomy, where we are engaging with whatever we call it.
Hmm.
People didn't used to call it autonomy.
Yeah.
West didn't call it autonomy. but he was, I think, favouring that kind of thing, and other educators in the past. Um, I didn't, so I never called it. I've never promoted it as a rescue strategy for anybody because I'm not. I'm very unwilling ever to say that any one approach is best for everybody. But I have found since we theorised that with Harry, since we've talked about teachers' own autonomy, etc., that it does correspond with the experiences of many people that I've come across, and the idea of pedagogy, or he didn't call it pedagogy of autonomy, a rescue strategy which involves the kind of engaging with students'
Mm-hmm.
autonomy, came from a teacher, Gamini Fonseca in Sri Lanka. I edited a book in 2003 with David Palfreyman, and I wanted something from a global South context. And I'd met Gamini, and he talked about lack of textbooks in a Sri Lankan village. He was a teacher there. Lack of textbooks. He got the students memorizing, or encouraged them to memorize songs and poems, which they would then carry around in their heads. And they would talk about the poems. They would use the language that was in the students' heads from memorizing in that way to learn to go further with their English. He called it a rescue strategy, and that phrase just stuck with me. And I think I used that in the article with
Yeah.
Harry, because difficult circumstances like the large classes, the lack of textbooks, they force a teacher to try and find to overcome those circumstances. And can I just mention that it's interesting that Lenny Dam, who's a famous teacher in Denmark, they've got plenty of technology. It's very different context. But it's very interesting how her own experience of starting to negotiate with students came about in exactly the same way. The students were bored. They were not working. They were not. She just one day as she described it, she banged down on the desk, and all her she had a bracelet of beads, and they all went flying everywhere. And she just said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" Just like that. And then after silence, they started telling her that hadn't been her intention. Anyway, so they started negotiating different kinds of group work. So in that kind of sense, engaging with students, what they think they want to do, you don't have to follow it exactly. But these days, what power do you have as a teacher actually to to tell them what they're doing? The students are more free now. That's a reality. We are more free, I think,
Yeah.
as teachers if we recognize it. I know we're afraid that we won't have a job. We want to do the best that we can for our institution, but our institutions are sometimes they don't know what to do either.
Yeah.
They're asking us to invent it. Actually, they may be giving us lots of rules and regulations, but we are actually more free in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
We're less free in the sense of our own mental problems, or issues, our family issues, our the stresses that are around us. So we can invent new things with our students. Maybe that's what I want to say.
Yeah.
And the students hope are inventing things as well with their parents' help in new ways.
Yeah.
That's something else that's
That's
because
what.
it's always we can't do things completely on our own. That's not autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
We develop through engagement with others,
Yeah.
and I suppose that's the second. How to engage, how to find ways that we can re-engage with students.
Yeah.
That's crucial, I think. I think that's all we really have to think about these days. Is how can we actually communicate? How can we find out the situations that others are in?
Yeah. And as I
Isn't
said
that the most
before,
important?
finding new ways of engagement and experimenting more. And I think your uh, talk here was perfect today, and I think made us have a lot of other questions. But it was perfect in the sense that it provided us not a way, but it provided us thoughts that can help us in our future work in what comes ahead, because we need to invent new ways. We need to invent new ways of teaching and new ways of fostering autonomy. And I thank you so much
Yeah.
for.
Thank you, Ronaldo, for giving me the opportunity to reflect. because
Yeah.
we, as you say, we can rely to some extent on what's gone before, but we need to be thinking creatively and in a new way. So thanks for giving me the opportunity, and thanks very much for this series. And I'll be looking forward to the next conversations. Thanks.
Yeah. There's
And that's
just there's just one question here. Do you mind if I ask you?
sure. Yeah.
So uh, there is one girl. Actually, I know her. She says, "From your experience, I guess you've probably seen many cultural differences in Japan and in the UK when it comes to teaching and learning practices. Despite such differences, is there something common to those practices that could be applied to any context?"
Okay. I prefer to think of it in a different way, and that's my right, isn't it? I can sort of turn the question around if you don't mind.
No, you
Um,
feel free.
there are many differences, cultural differences, educational differences, of course,
Hmm.
context by context. Um, I do like to think of, in terms of our job, our profession. I do like to say, let's think about the school, the institution, the classroom culture. You called it, I think, a culture of learning
Yeah.
earlier. Let's focus on that. So, of course, we want to recognise the social, political, economic constraints around it, and if you like, the national cultural things. But I'm very suspicious, like Adrian Holiday, of national cultural things. But so let's look more carefully at what, the schools, the context where we work in, which may vary very much from town to town, from institution to institution, and work within that. But that context, that environment, does produce or encourage a particular attitudes, particular cultures of learning,
Hmm.
and so you may find similarities which you might not expect if you're just thinking about Japanese culture versus French culture, etc. You may find things which are similar, and you may find things which are different. But you can find a lot of similarities, I think,
Yeah.
in across contexts, and work with those similarities. Now, for example, some of the similarities I've been talking about, which are completely, or not completely, which are relatively neglected within work on methodology in the UK, the USA, Australia, maybe, are these issues of large class, lack of resources. The situations confronting most teachers in the global south. Of course, all of these classrooms are different, but they share those things in common. So we need to think about how you can teach in such circumstances. Um, and students are not defined by national culture. Students
Yeah.
the new generations. They're defined by new ways of thinking. There's potential for change. Different generations, different experiences, and they're going to be very affected by these experiences, aren't they? I mean, our children and our students, and we don't know what's going to come out, but they'll be changed. So that's going to be very different across context. But I believe that maybe this final words, that every human being everywhere has a capacity and a desire, often, or that might be submerged, to take control, to have more responsibility, to take control of one's own life, and that doesn't vary across contexts, although it might be constrained, it might be pushed down in different places.
Yeah. Actually,
You go, you go, yeah.
during my
Go on.
PhD, I spent some time in Hong Kong, and I compared learner practices based. I investigated students' practices based on their metaphors that they produced, talking about language learning. And my innocent thought was that I would find many differences. And the differences were nothing compared to the similarities. I mean,
Mm.
so there are some ways of learning, there are some experiences that we all share. So I
Yeah,
like thinking about more, we are more the same than different.
yeah, yeah.
So thank you so much. I'm very happy. I think I learned a lot uh,
Me too.
in many senses. even about technology that we're using here. I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and I'll send you the link after this interview so you can see the comments and the messages that people send to you.
Thanks, Ronaldo. Thank you.
Thank you.
And good luck to everyone. Best wishes.
Yes. So thank you very much for those who are here watching, and we see you on Saturday with the next interview. So thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.